The railroad wrought a revolution. Armies to build their tracks and lots of casualties. Financing those machines and those armies required and created imperial fortunes. Some men grew very rich, some sweated and suffered so many injuries that mass unions and protest political parties were formed. Power, wealth, anger, and a new emphasis on speed, on work done by the hour as fast as possible. So these great machines brought on our world.
After the Civil War, railroads spread out westward, uniting the transportation of a country that had been reunited politically. The Union Pacific from the east met the Central Pacific from the west in Utah in the great event of the railroad age. Big tunnels through the mountains, turn the turbines of the mountain bridges built, nation made the tracks he will take for the iron. The events at Promontory came 4 years and a month after those at Appomattox. After the Civil War, the nation's greatest railroad race began between two companies, the Central Pacific of California and the Union Pacific, steaming out of Iowa, built largely by the Irish. This is the Iowa roadbed after more than 1,000 miles. That, the California roadbed after 700 mountainous miles. For each mile you laid, the government paid your company handsomely. Competition between the bosses, rivalry between the Chinese and the Irish crews. For 200 miles, they just kept on building right next to each other. Curses were exchanged, last night's work blown up, boulders rolled, shots fired, and finally the Congress said stop it and decreed that they'd roll back to Promontory for that famous negotiated settlement. The railroad race was international. The chief purpose of these lines meeting in Utah was to connect Chicago to Beijing and the trade to the Orient. These rails were laid to compete with the Suez Canal being built at the same time. It was the age of imperial transcontinental roads, the Cairo to Cape Town, the Trans-Siberian, and the Orient Express. The Central Pacific came up and over the Sierras after it was incorporated at Doc Strong's drugstore in Dutch Flat by an engineer from Bridgeport named Theodore Judah, who was called Crazy Judah because he kept insisting that a California road could be carried all the way to Chicago. Judah persuaded California's rich of his vision, and after failing to bring in masses of laborers from Mexico, they tried the Chinese.
I know what drove a lot of the men to work on the railroad was a desperate personal need. Many of these men came from extreme poverty. They were driven out of China to look for work by the Taiping Rebellion, by the Opium Wars. But whether or not they understood the immensity of what the railroad, transcontinental railroad, meant, I don't know.
What was it like to work on that railroad up from the Sierras and into this kind of country?
Most of the work in those days, of course, was done with a pickaxe, perhaps a shovel, little black gunpowder, blasting materials. That was it. You had sheer granite cliff faces. Men were lowered down in baskets to chip out holes, fill it full of black powder, and then ignite it and try to get out of the way before it blew.
There was a darkness that lay behind even the most celebrated moments of the railroad age, even as the railroads achieved their national union after the Civil War.